we okay with the audio up there? Oh, and I'm quite loud on here. Yes, please. That's better. It's weird. I've got two mics. It takes a bit of getting used to. So, happy Saturday, everybody. Do we have notices? We've done notices. Excellent. It's already taken care of. Lovely. Well, thank you all for coming. This is our second week on mental illness. Last week we focused on Genesis 3 and the fall and connecting that with a biblical understanding of human suffering and of how mental illness is caused. This week we're going to sort of flip the perspective around and we're going to look at a biblical understanding of how mental illness might be addressed, and we're going to do that through two primary lenses. They are going to be through concepts of blessing and the concept of peace, or shalom in the Old Testament, or eirene, I found out recently, in Greek in the New Testament. So that's what we're going to be doing. So quick recap of last week. We looked at the curse and the broken relationships, so broken relationships between God and humankind. Adam and Eve felt the need to flee from God when he came walking through the garden. We have broken relationships between humans. We have Adam and Eve starting to sort of blame each other for who ate the fruit and why things had started to go wrong. We have broken relationship between humans and their work. Adam is told that he's going to have to toil and that the ground itself is going to resist his efforts to cultivate. The fruitful times of Eden are a thing of the past. Humankind's relationship with our own nature and with the nature around us is broken. Again, the nature is going to resist our attempts to cultivate it, and women are going to have pain in childbirth. Our own bodies are going to fight against us. And then we have, lastly, a broken relationship with ourselves. Adam and Eve start to be introduced to the very unpleasant concepts of shame, doubt, guilt, and all these other worries which can rack us from time to time. If we can move on to our first reading for this week, we're going to get straight into it. So this is subtitled there, The Blessings of Obedience. So this is this bit in Deuteronomy where God is talking to the people about the promised land and what will happen, how things will go. And the blessings of obedience go, therefore, be careful to obey every command I am giving you today, so you may have strength to go in and take over the land you're about to enter. If you obey, you will enjoy a long life in the land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors and to you, their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. Please keep it going. For the land you're about to enter and take over is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you planted your seed and made irrigation ditches with your foot as in a vegetable garden. Rather, the land you will soon take over is a land of hills and valleys with plenty of rain, a land that the Lord your God cares for. He watches over it through each season of the year. Yes, if you carefully obey the commands I am giving you today, if you love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and soul, then he will send the rains in their proper seasons, the early and late rains, so you're bringing the harvest of grain, new wine, and olive oil. He will give you lush pasture land for your livestock, and you yourselves will have all you want to eat. So, as with last week, we're going to have to treat our subject material this week with care. When it comes to the Old Testament blessings and to some Old Testament characters, blessing is associated with material wealth. You know, your flocks will multiply, you will have grain, new wine, all those sorts of things. And there's no denying that an Old Testament concept of blessing comes with material sufficiency and material wealth in a certain sense. But of course we also know that as followers of the ways of Jesus, that greater wealth does not mean greater blessing in a second covenant context. You know, just if you end up being very wealthy, well, that's nice for you, but it doesn't necessarily indicate God's great blessing on you for your righteous life. Equally, if you don't have lots of money, it doesn't mean the converse. It's not necessarily that you've done anything wrong. So we need to bear that in mind and be careful, but still, up to a certain point, money does buy better mental health. That point is enough to pay your bills and have a little bit left over for a rainy day. essentially the point where money is no longer a daily stress. After that, more money isn't associated with better mental health, but meeting people's material needs, having enough, is an important part of having good mental health. If you're constantly worried about how you're going to pay the bills, are you going to have a roof over your head, where's your food's going to come from, that is a very, very stressful way to live. And it is no surprise that for most mental illnesses, with the kind of notable exception of anorexia nervosa, the lower your household income, the higher your risk is of having mental illness. But here, if we can just roll it back one, yeah, there we go. So it's not just about, this blessing isn't purely about material wealth and blessing. What we have here is, for the land you're about to enter is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you planted your seed and made irrigation ditches with your feet, as in a vegetable garden. Well, I have to say I've never irrigated a vegetable garden personally, but we do live in Britain where rain just comes out of the sky. And so in Egypt, you were digging irrigation ditches, these Israelite slaves, if you can imagine. Now, I've never dug an irrigation ditch in Egypt, but at sort of like 45-degree heat, doing hard physical labour sounds pretty awful to me. The land that you're going to, the rain just comes out of the sky. You don't need to dig an irrigation ditch. It just falls on the land. That, I'm telling you, is an improvement in both your pay and your working conditions. You have bountiful crops, and you're not having to do not as much hard physical labour in 45-degree heat as you were in Egypt. So I think we need to get, all the unions hooked up, given the current season of our country finds itself in. This goes back to the curse, of course, and the Old Testament authors would have been very much aware of patterning, and that's how the Old Testament works, right? You have the themes which are developed in Genesis, and they are patterned, they are run over and over again. So we have here something which is addressing that part of the curse where labour is becoming a problem, and we know that bad labour conditions can make people feel very stressed. Work stress, bad bosses, having just more work to do than you can cope with is really bad for your mental health. Conversely, rewarding work with, farming where the rain just comes from the sky and you get a bountiful crop, you're putting the work in, but you're getting the reward out, and that is satisfying and promotes really good mental health. And we know that even in really severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia, if you can get people into supported employment, their outcomes in all areas of life tend to be much, much better. As a church, there's probably, we have kids stuff, we have Storehouse, the Methodists here have their sort of, their stores of food for people. It's not perhaps quite so easy to think about how we might improve sort of labour relations or working conditions or that sort of thing, but there are people in the congregation here who will have, they'll have some degree of managerial responsibility, and part of how we can share our blessings is by seeking to, advocate for those people perhaps who are maybe part of our team in the company that we work in, that sort of thing. There are ways we can find of sharing this aspect of the blessing. So then we also have, let me see, where are we? Where's the bit about having long life? Maybe that was slightly earlier. There we go, a long life in the land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors. So again, thinking back Genesis 3, we have the introduction of death. Now, long life isn't exactly the opposite of death, but it's a very good start, I would say. And so, again, thinking about what does the concept of blessing entail in the Old Testament? Well, it entails an old life, reaching a ripe old age, a crown of years, as it's sometimes described. And again, this is fairly natural consequence, but people who, suffer serious physical illnesses of all descriptions, that's a really stressful thing. That will have a knock-on impact on people's mental health, and equally experiencing blessing includes, in the biblical concept, experience of good physical health. Again, perhaps not something within our gift as a congregation, but something to bear in mind. And hopefully what I'm trying to do through last week and this week is, as much as anything, sort of demystifying. I know I'm doing a lot of pointing out the very obvious, but what I'm hoping to do is bring together spheres of understanding which, certainly in my experience, not a lot of people bring together. Certainly through my medical training, nobody ever really talked about theology, and through my experience of now sort of 35 years of church services, not a lot of people have really talked about mental illness. So hopefully this sort of demystifying most of this stuff is really quite common sense, but if we can have a good biblical grounding, a biblical foundation, a framework to work with, we can bring these spheres of knowledge together, hopefully understand things, demystify things a bit, and allow us to approach them in a systematic way. So, in terms of the death, that was part of the disrupted relationship with our environment. Another thing we have here is a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, milk you have to get yourself. You have to grow your cow, feed your cow, get up in the morning and milk your cow. So that is part of the labour aspect of the blessing. Honey, however, you just leave the bees. The bees do their bee thing. They go to, flowers, etc., etc. Just walk through the woods. Follow the bees and you get yourself some honey. That is part of nature's abundance. That is part of God's general provision. So again, here in blessing, we are seeing the abundance of nature being part of God's blessing. And if we want to cultivate blessing, then we need to think about how are we going to cultivate nature? How are we going to restore it to the point, as much as is within our power to do so, where it will provide for us of its own accord, what these days economists would call natural services. But you can see it's not exactly the same concept, but it is in there. We have here part of humans' relationship with God. So the emphasis is on obeying commands. But if we go on to the last bit, we have the bit about it being God's land, God looking after the land. And we know the Israelites are bringing with them at this stage, they don't have the temple, but they are bringing with them the tabernacle. They have God's presence amongst the people. And that is a source of great blessing. And in the biblical understanding, of course, no blessing is complete without God's presence and being under God's rule. Now, in psychology and psychiatry circles, there's been quite an antagonistic relationship to particularly Christianity over the years, sort of starting with Freud, I suppose, and then moving on to this idea of, anyone heard of this thing called the locus of control? So there's this idea that, and it's certainly, I don't dispute the general principle, that people who believe that they have very little agency in their life and that life kind of happens to them, tend to get really stuck, and if they develop a mental illness, they find it very hard to shift, get out of that situation, change the things in life that they need to get them to a point where they can have better mental health, particularly relevant for sort of depression, anxiety, those more common mental illnesses. And so for a lot of time, there was this argument in psychology and psychiatry that, well, religion's kind of like the ultimate form of having an external locus of control, that this idea that if people follow God and they pray, that they're not going to do anything to change their own circumstances, they're just going to pray, wait for God to do stuff and be very, very passive. Now, of course, we know that's not true at all, and that actually knowing that God is with you and that God has a purpose and that his presence is there beside you actually can really help you persevere doing difficult things that you need to get done in order to push past a period of mental illness. Particularly with anxiety disorders, the only real way to get past an anxiety disorder is to find a way of facing that fear and to meet it and to stick with it and to just get a little further each time. And knowing that God will be with you on that journey is an extremely, to me, valuable thing for people. And if we're able to foster that and support that, and of course, God has his own presence with us, and he also gives us a family, a bigger extended family. Families we're born into, some of them are great, some of them not so great. But we can, collectively, as a church family, foster those relationships and that support and that presence and being alongside people. And we can, I feel, mediate that presence of God to other people. We can be his hands and his feet. Again, this is all stuff you know. I'm just hopefully making those connections from one thing to the other thing in a way that allows us to think it through and make sense of the situation. So if we can move on to our next reading, I'm going to shift now from blessing on to peace. And I know Christmas has only just gone, and this reading you only ever tend to see at Christmas time, but never mind, it's relevant for today. So to us, a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness. From that time on and forevermore, the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. So if we can scroll back to the Prince of Peace bit, because that's really where we're going to focus in on today. So this is the Prince of Shalom. What is Shalom? We should probably start there. Shalom is completeness, wholeness. When you finish building your house is now Shalom. If you have two countries that are at war and they make peace, that is also Shalom. If in Deuteronomy your cow goes and eats somebody else's garden and you pay them some money as reparations, which obviously happens to us a lot, then you are now once you've paid the reparations, you have restored shalom between you and your neighbour, and you probably need to do something about your naughty cow in order to prevent it happening again. So that is one concept of shalom. There is what you might call an interpersonal aspect of shalom. And so that is one part of being the Prince of Peace. And again, fairly straightforwardly, that conflict between people, whether that is a war and people who have survived through war suffering with PTSD, whether that is people having conflict within a family and that causing people to be depressed, whether it is being bullied at school, at work and developing social anxiety. Conflict between people has a very direct cause or relationship with mental illness. And so if we are going to be followers of the Prince of Peace and part of, if we scroll over again, his government of peace, then we should think about what are we doing to restore relationships. Now, this isn't always going to be easy. Sometimes it may not be possible at all, but our orientation should be towards peace. And when I say peace, we're talking about that sense of completeness, wholeness, fullness in relationships. He's not the prince of, pretending to be nice to each other even though we hate each other. He's not the prince of avoiding conflict because I don't like it. He is the Prince of Peace in the sense of full and complete wholeness. So that's what we should be aiming for, but we've got to be real that in the world sometimes we can't always achieve peace in the way we'd like. In my work, I see people for what's called a mental health act assessment, where we think about bringing people into hospital against their wishes, what's usually called sectioning. Now, in those situations, you might have the patient themselves, not uncommonly, who really, really doesn't want to come into hospital. And you might have a relative who really, really needs that person to go into hospital. Now, myself and the team making the assessment, we've got to make a decision. Do we bring the person into hospital or not? If we bring them into hospital, we're not going to have peace with that person who really doesn't want to be in hospital. If we don't bring them into hospital, we're not going to have peace with that relative who really does need the person to be in hospital. So sometimes achieving peace for all concerned can't always be achieved, but our orientation should be, wherever possible, to seek peace, to seek wholeness, to seek restoration in relationships. And where we find ourselves because of the peculiarities of a situation where there can be no peace with someone, whatever the outcome, we really need to pray for the Spirit to go before us, we need to pray for wisdom, and we need to try our best not to give up on seeking reconciliation, even if we cannot maintain peace over whatever situation it is that faces us right now. As well as that interpersonal aspect of peace, if we move on to our next reading, so John 14, "But the Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything that I've said to you. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." This is a little excerpt of a bit where Jesus is talking about the disciples trying to align their priorities with Jesus' priorities and with God's priorities. And so the peace in this concept here, it's not shalom, this is eirene, the Greek one, because we're in the New Testament now. This is peace in terms of one's actions being aligned with one's values, and specifically with God's values. So this is peace not between people, this is peace within ourselves. This is going back to our Genesis 3 problem of Adam and Eve feeling shame. And again, this should be our orientation, right? It should be to try to align ourselves with God's purposes and God's priorities. And ultimately that will bring us the most peace if we are successful in doing so. But as with peace between people, we need to be very honest about the real world that we live in and the real situations we face. We all have thoughts, feelings, impulses and urges that we do not want and do not align with what we might see as sort of our core values. This has certainly been something I've had to learn through my training as a psychiatrist, because you're not supposed to really hate some of your patients. You're supposed to be a caring, kind doctor who is always there for people and always not just does nice things for people, but feels nice feelings towards people. And this is not too different to how we tend to feel in church quite instinctively, don't we? We know we follow a God of love, a God of peace, a God of non-violence, a God of charity. But we don't always feel massively charitable. Sometimes we just want to shout at people. Sometimes we feel attracted to people who we really ought not to feel attracted to. And just denying that those things are happening is a very instinctive and natural go-to strategy for pretty much everybody. Very few of us have one of these unwelcome urges that that happen, but really don't mesh well with our core view of our ideal selves, of how we really want to be. We all have them. And denial is a very common strategy. But if we deny that these things exist, much as if I denied that I really don't like some of my patients, then it's going to come out in other ways. I might decide that person is better and discharge them from hospital before they're really better, mostly because I actually secretly want to get rid of them. But I can't admit to myself that I don't want to get rid of them, so I go, yes, there's these very long and complicated reasons why they're much better, and now they can go home. So it's going to come out one way or another, and I'm never going to be able to address it until I can bring those thoughts and feelings into a place of acceptance. And acceptance does not mean saying, well, that's absolutely fine then. Acceptance means acknowledging they're there, not denying they're there, and going, okay, they're there, now I can work on them. Now that I know, I've noticed that whenever this particular patient is around who does whatever it is that they do that's particularly annoying, that I get some uncomfortable emotions and feelings about them. And actually, if I can be aware of that in the moment, I can master that and I can act in a more professional way, and I can stop it coming out in these unintended consequences. Likewise, in our Christian life, if we know we have thoughts and feelings which would not reflect well on us if we were to voice them, and are not aligned with God's priorities, once we become aware of them, we can start consciously working on them. And we can start working on things which will help us gradually, it's not going to be a quick fix, it's not going to be easy, but we can, once we're aware of these things, gradually start realigning ourselves, and over time, those instinctive reactions will line up better with God's priorities and with how Jesus would want us to live. But as I say, it's all too easy to fall in that pattern of feeling, I'm a good Christian, I couldn't possibly have just thought that, or I couldn't possibly have just felt this particular feeling, and to get really stuck. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of our, not uncommonly within churches, those failures to reconcile our own conflicts can then leak out and become wider conflicts between each other as well. Because if we have something about ourselves which we really wish wasn't there, when we see that in other people, it tends to press our buttons massively. If we ourselves know deep down that, we have a very short temper, that's probably the thing that's going to really annoy us about somebody else, is if they're really snappy and short-tempered, because that seeing it in somebody else makes it harder to deny what is present within ourselves. And so if we wish to have peace with the Spirit and peace with each other, we need to try our best to be honest with ourselves about those unwanted thoughts and feelings. Bring them before God. Pray for forgiveness where it's necessary. Might not be necessary, but if it is, pray for that. And accept it insofar as acknowledge its existence and try to work on it. There is nothing, when Jesus is talking about, blessed are the humble, blessed are the meek, he's not talking about blessed are the people who spend hours every day beating themselves up about thoughts and feelings that they don't want to be there. That's about people prioritizing others over themselves. So, for today, I think that was probably what I wanted to say and to summarize. So, again, as I've said a couple of times already, not about reinventing the wheel, not about stating things which are massively complicated, but about saying if, as a church, we want a biblical lens through which to approach mental illness, and in this case, approach promoting good mental health, then I would start with the idea of blessing and how can we experience, appreciate and share blessings, and start with the concept of shalom or peace and how can we appreciate that peace, how can we start working on that peace within ourselves, and how can we consciously seek to build and encourage peace amongst each other as a church community, but in all the other spheres where we find ourselves. It's going to be Messy Church next week. The week after that, we are going to look at God's response to his people in distress. So we're going to do some like Elijah up the mountain and that sort of thing. Maybe a bit of Lamentations if I'm feeling fancy. And then in the last week, we're going to go on to looking at some Christian contemplative traditions as a perhaps a slightly more concrete takeaway that some people might fancy and some people might find it really gets up their nose, but we'll see. They tend to be a bit Marmite, the Christian contemplative stuff. So, thank you all very much for your attention and for listening. Feel free to catch me afterwards if there's stuff that you want to discuss. Thank you all.